Welcome everyone to this Research Insights session on identities and public attitudes in Northern Ireland. I'm really delighted to introduce an excellent panel, Clare Rice, Katy, Hayward and Lisa Whitten, who will be talking to us about different aspects of the complex patterns of identities across Northern Ireland, about public attitudes towards the protocol, and perhaps looking ahead to the elections coming up in May. Very keen for people to ask questions as the presentations go on. You can ask them through the Slido system. We're going to go through a series of presentations, starting with Clare's presentation, then moving on to Katy and ending with Lisa. And after that, we'll move into a kind of roundtable discussion phase. So without any further ado, I'll ask Clare to share her screen and start with our first presentation of the afternoon. Clare?
Thanks very much, Dan. I'll just take a wee second here. And hopefully you're all able to see that okay?
Yep, that's excellent.
Excellent. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much, Dan, for the invitation to contribute to this event today. So I am wearing a couple of hats today. I'm in part looking back to research that was done as part of the Performing Identities project, which was led by the University of Newcastle. I'm taking the some information that we have from that research project and putting it into the contemporary context to look at how some of those issues have translated. And then I'll be taking a little bit of a look ahead to what those might mean for the upcoming Assembly election. So the Performing Identities project spanned for 2 years, and it considered, in the wake of Brexit, different approaches to how Brexit might impact identity in Northern Ireland, and how that might interact with governance going forward from that. And as part of that research project, we undertook a series of interviews across 2019 and into early 2020 with people from across Northern Ireland, asking them in a very broad sort of sense, how might Brexit impact their identity? And while that was the launch pad for the interviews, we found that we ended up having conversations and discussions that really spanned into the history of Northern Ireland, looking to the future for Northern Ireland, and everything politically, socially, and every which way in between. So in reflecting on those interviews, there were three sort of broad themes that I kept in mind while looking through the information that our participants had shared with us in preparing this presentation today. And they've been perspectives on Brexit's anticipated impact, perspectives on politics within Northern Ireland, and identity diversity in Northern Ireland. Now, 2019 seems an awful long time ago at this point. A week seems a long time in the world, in the current climate. So it's worth taking a second just to reflect on what was happening at the time the interviews were being conducted. So between 2017 and 2020, we had what I refer to as an institutional hiatus in Northern Ireland. Others may have more colourful language to describe that window of time. But essentially what happened was our Deputy First Minister resigned in early 2017. And due to the nature of the institutional arrangements in Northern Ireland, it meant that we had what is effectively and colloquially referred to as a collapse of the institutions that persisted for 3 years. In the interim, we had the DUP enter a confidence and supply arrangement with the Conservative Party and government over in Westminster under the helm of Theresa May. And indeed, we had elections at every possible level, and they're contentious at the best of times in Northern Ireland, as some of you will know, but especially so in the midst of Brexit, institutional collapse, the reasons for the institutional collapse. All of these further compounded and exacerbated some of the challenges that were being seen politically in Northern Ireland at that point in time, and indeed set in train arguably what is leading towards a slightly different set of circumstances for the upcoming Assembly election, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in due course. So it's worth also highlighting that there is an inextricable character that links identity, politics, and Brexit within Northern Ireland. And it's something that has been spoken about a lot, but it's always worth revisiting and re-emphasising this. Now, on the left-hand side of your screen, we have data that comes from the most recent census data results that we have currently, so that's the 2011 census, which maps those who are identified as British and those who are identified as Irish to greater and lesser degrees across Northern Ireland. Now, when you take that into consideration and look at the map on the right-hand side of your screen, the map on the right-hand side reflects how constituencies voted within the European referendum. And we see that there is a lot of crossover between those two. We see that for largely unionist identifying individuals in Northern Ireland, that correlates almost very succinctly with the Leave votes in Northern Ireland, and similarly then for those who identify as nationalist with Remain votes. And that's not a huge surprise, because one of the key political dynamics around the Brexit referendum in 2016 was that there was a split along those traditional sort of party quasi-sectarian lines in Northern Ireland, insofar as the nationalist parties were broadly in support of remaining within the European Union and unionist parties more so in favour of leaving. And that's a trend and a pattern that has continued to develop and to permeate and feature within the discourse of Brexit in Northern Ireland, and indeed around the Northern Ireland Protocol in the time since then. Again, it's worth emphasising that at the time that the interviews that I'm going to look at here were completed, the details of the Brexit deal were not known. So we were at a stage where the negotiations were ongoing. There was talk around that time of the infamous backstop, and it wasn't in the lexicon even at that point around the Northern Ireland Protocol. So it's a very different set of circumstances and very much reflections on, I guess, the unknown at that point of what was going to lie ahead for Northern Ireland politically and in terms of Brexit. And indeed, in thinking about how all of these various elements would interlink and interact with that historical picture that comprises Northern Ireland in the long run. So I've included here just a few quotes from our research. And when it came to the interviews, it was unsurprising to find that there was a lot of overlap between the various elements that I've raised so far. Now, we see here in this sample selection of quotes that identity is especially complex in Northern Ireland, and that's hardly breaking news in itself. But we see that Brexit started to bring in a new dynamic to how identity was being thought about in Northern Ireland. The quotes here that I've selected range from what Brexit contributed to identity and its understanding both within and between and indeed of others in Northern Ireland, to how these dynamics have changed, indeed why Brexit evoked sentiments of concern about the return to hard border in the island of Ireland, and how the Brexit arrangements, as I mentioned, which were still unknown at the time, were raising concerns about how cultural diversity in Northern Ireland could be maintained and supported going forward. Now, of particular note here, and it was a recurring theme across the interviews, was a concern that Northern Ireland wasn't being represented politically in Westminster, again, as a result of that confidence and supply arrangement that the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, had entered with the Conservative government. And more generally, I guess a wider sense of concern that Northern Ireland was a very small piece in a much bigger jigsaw that was starting to develop. There were fears that Northern Ireland would be essentially collateral damage in the Brexit process, and within that the consequences would be most acutely felt for those who identified as unionist and those who identified as nationalist, for different reasons, again, that I will touch on as I go through here. But there was also a sense of concern that for individuals who didn't identify in either of those terms within Northern Ireland, that it would be much more difficult for them to feed into the wider debate around Brexit, but at a more local level, for their representation to actually be possible. So essentially, if I can boil down a lot of quite complex dynamics, and I've referenced the sheer number of elections that we had, we started to see a hardening of the extremes of the political spectrum in Northern Ireland. As we moved through that phase between 2017 to 2019 in particular, we started to see that there was more of an emergence of centre ground, non-aligned voters in Northern Ireland, and that became colloquially referred to as the Alliance Surge, as one of the parties that benefited particularly from that. So there was a broader question at the time of the interviews around, well, what if people don't fall into these succinct either or camps? And we start to see how that in its own way contributed to a change in the dynamics, the political dynamics in Northern Ireland. One quote that I want to highlight in particular actually from here is this final one at the bottom. Any politician who claims to speak for Northern Ireland has been totally disingenuous. And in many ways, that sense of unease and uncertainty around that interaction and that relationship between political levels in Northern Ireland and at Westminster is something that prevails. It's something that for the Democratic Unionist Party in particular has been a pressure point, particularly coming up to this election now where there is such a heavy focus on the protocol. And it's interesting as well to note that, yes, we have these political dynamics within Northern Ireland, but they're very much shaped by and indeed contribute to the shaping of those interjurisdictional relationships and working relationships. So I'm talking here between not just Westminster and Northern Ireland, but looking as well to how those interactions happen with Scotland and Wales as well. So reflecting on the interviews, while the context since then has very much changed, the issues that they still give rise to are very much still prevalent, and they underpin a lot of the commentary and the narrative around the political and social dynamics of Northern Ireland currently. Knowing now the content of that Brexit deal and indeed the Northern Ireland Protocol, the content indeed of the arrangements and their fallout now, this has narrowed the focus of the discontent that remains from different angles within Northern Ireland on the issue. And this has perhaps been no more clearly demonstrated than with scenes of violence that hit screens across the globe from Northern Ireland in response to the protocol. And I include this slide here just to give a sense of the sort of, I guess, anger and extent of the frustrations that happened around the time. These images were taken around about this time last year, so not all that long ago. And it's important to emphasise that the protocol itself was not the sole reason for the discontent and the unrest that we've seen in Northern Ireland. There were myriad other factors that contributed to that. But a line can clearly be drawn between the sort of sentiments, concerns and issues that we were picking up through our interviews in 2019, early 2020, to this sense and this situation of unrest arising within Northern Ireland. And indeed, that in itself all pulls together and feeds through into the current situation. So I guess if there's anything that I really want to emphasise through this, it's that none of these events have happened in isolation of each other. And very much it's their cumulative impact that has both led to the political situation we have now and will shape what happens in the time ahead. Now, there's a lot going on in Northern Irish politics at the moment that I'm sure we'll get into in Q&A. So this is just a very brief summary of some of the key issues that have shaped what's happening at the moment and indeed are leading the coverage and the narrative of the Assembly Election 22 or A22 as it's been shortened to. But as you'll know, the First Minister of Northern Ireland, Paul Givan, resigned from his post at the start of February. Very much at the direction of his party leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. And it came on the back of what has been a year of very deep internal strife for the DUP. It's well noted that they moved through 3 leaders within the space of a couple of months, one of those leaders being in post for only 21 days. In the wake of that then, there has been issues around the protocol. Indeed, the working relationships within Northern Ireland itself have become rather strained. And it culminated in February, indeed only the day before the First Minister resigned, with the Minister for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, Edwin Poots, issuing an order to his department to stop border checks at ports in Northern Ireland. And these are checks that are required under the Northern Ireland Protocol. So that set in train a tension point and indeed an issue between the department itself and the minister as to whether or not that order would be listened to, should be obeyed. And indeed it was challenged in court. And those checks continued, as far as I'm aware, pretty much unimpeded. I don't believe at any point they actually stopped. And in addition to this, the DUP has also in recent months issued a 7-point checklist of criteria that they expect any changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol to meet. Now, this is important to highlight because the underpinning factor for the resignation of the First Minister was in protest at the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's something that the DUP have been very vocal about, and indeed Sir Geoffrey Donaldson in particular has been pushing for since he became leader of the party in June, to the extent where actually he was facing ridicule and being very heavily criticised for not having taken the step of collapsing the institutions as he was threatening to do so. So in that sense, it was inevitable that it was going to happen at some point. Politically, it was difficult to predict when that would happen because the DUP, because of its internal strife, needed as much time as possible to prepare electorally for the election that we knew had to happen by the 5th of May this year. And we start to see that there's a very complex picture building here where the DUP was backed into the corner of having to do something to protect itself electorally. But the consequences of that action in collapsing the institutions is something that everybody in Northern Ireland is feeling currently. The big question is if the DUP have been happy to resign their First Minister now in protest at the protocol, well, what happens after the election if nothing changes with regard to the protocol in the interim? And the leader of the DUP, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson himself, has said that it's very unlikely that anything will change. Then what happens for power sharing thereafter? To add another layer of complexity, I'd mentioned previously about those political dynamics around the 2016 referendum, some of the concerns that were being felt on the ground through our interviewees around what would happen in terms of a polarisation or a repolarisation of politics in Northern Ireland. That is still very much present now. Not all of the parties are against the Northern Ireland Protocol. The majority of parties within the Assembly are in favour of working, albeit with different intentions in some areas, towards refining or reworking the protocol to make it more practical and to address some of the issues that have been seen with it in terms of its operation in Northern Ireland. Now, the UUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, is that there's a little bit of ambiguity around their position on it. They have joined with the Democratic Unionist Party and Traditional Unionist Voice, TUV, in calling for the protocol to be removed, very much projecting a solid pro-unionist and anti-protocol position on the issue, while at the same time speaking in terms, much softer terms around the protocol of trying to find resolutions to the issues with it. In addition to this, we also have the, I guess, more traditional, more familiar type of dynamics in Northern Ireland feeding in to this picture around the First and Deputy First Minister. It's a shared office. One can't do one thing without the other. They work jointly together. If one resigns, they both resign effectively. And there has been a lot of focus around the name of First and Deputy First Minister. Linked to this, there have been questions put to the DUP around whether or not they would be willing to nominate a member of their team to the post of Deputy First Minister in the event that Sinn Féin returns a majority of seats, or not majority, the largest number of seats to the Assembly following this election. And to put it softly, some of the softer interpretations of what they've said is that they would be reluctant to. Certainly the steps that have been led would suggest that they would be more unlikely than likely to accept that sort of a situation. It also has highlighted some of the institutional anomalies within Northern Ireland, particularly with regard to the others. So to give a very brief overview, we have 3 designate groups within the Assembly: Unionists, Nationalists and Others. The Alliance Party I'd mentioned previously, they are part of this Others group. And one of the anomalies that is receiving a lot of attention now is the fact that for example, the Alliance Party is the largest within that Other designate group. They could, in theory, return somebody who could be a First Minister by being the largest party in the Assembly after an election. But the institutional framework that's in place means that actually, if they received enough seats to be the second largest party, they would be unable to nominate to the post of Deputy First Minister. So that's starting another conversation, again linked to some of the concerns that I'd mentioned earlier around, well, what happens to individuals who do not identify in terms of unionism and nationalism anymore? Now, it's not something that will more than likely need addressed following this coming election, but certainly in the future, it's something that will require more concerted focus and conversation. And indeed, it feeds into another question around Assembly reform and whether or not the institutions in a post-Brexit Northern Ireland are suitably designed to be able to address all of the interests and issues of people in Northern Ireland, and indeed to reflect the extent of different political perspectives within the area. So I will round up here just by very quickly thinking about what next. And I've mentioned the potential issues around the nomination of a Deputy First Minister following the election. There is a lot of evidence, or at least suggestive evidence, that would indicate that perhaps Sinn Féin may be in a position to return more seats to the Assembly, more people to seats in the Assembly than the DUP, which would mean that they would have the option of nominating somebody to be the First Minister, which would be the first time that somebody from a nationalist party has held that position in Northern Ireland. Add into that as well the unlikelihood of any movement with regard to the protocol, such that would meet the criteria of the DUP in that regard. And we start to see that actually it's not the election, or indeed the election campaign, that is the most difficult element of the political spectrum and the political issues here in Northern Ireland currently, but actually it's what will come after the election that will make things more difficult. We have new legislation that has been passed in Westminster, stemming from the New Decade New Approach Agreement agreed in 2020, which puts in place essentially caretaker provisions to mean that there won't be a full collapse of government or governance in Northern Ireland following the election in the event that such difficulties do actually come forward. But there are a whole host of anomalies with that. One example being, what if one of the ministers who is currently in post is not returned to a seat following the election? Do they still carry on in a caretaker post, or would it be possible for another member of their party to be able to take that position in their place? And I say that with particular reference to Edwin Poots, who I mentioned earlier, the current Agriculture Minister, who does not currently have his name on a ballot for this election, in part because of some of the internal dynamics of the party and issues that I referred to earlier. One thing that I will close on, and it's something that I imagine Katy or Lisa will be picking up on, but there is provision within the Northern Ireland Protocol for a vote to happen within the Assembly due in 2024 on the continuation of Articles 5 to 10 of the Protocol. That's something that isn't really receiving a lot of attention in the political campaigning at the moment. I'm not entirely sure why that is the case. There's a lot of focus on the here and now of the protocol, and very much in the short-term reflection of what is going on with the protocol now, but very little towards looking ahead for that, which I think is quite an interesting anomaly to highlight. So I'll round up then by saying that a lot of the themes that we saw were beginning to emerge in 2019 in response to the 2016 Brexit referendum have very much fed into the political development that we have seen in Northern Ireland in the time since, and indeed will shape what happens in the time forward as well. And I'll wrap it up there.
Thanks so much, Claire. That was fascinating. Just before we move on to Katy, I wonder if I could press you a little bit on your sense of how development since 2019 and that performing identities research being conducted, how that's impacted on the sense of identity of people who don't feel themselves strongly identifying either with the Protestant loyalist unionist or the Catholic nationalist camps, as it were.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think initially in the wake of Brexit, there was very much a sense of the people who didn't align to one side or the other feeling quite lost. It was complicated. That's not the right word, but it was made a much more difficult situation, I think, in that even those non-aligned parties did adopt a position on the Brexit issue. So for those individuals who might have, just not been confident in their position on Brexit, they were almost forced or tarred with the same brush as those nationalist and unionist parties in holding their own particular perspective on Brexit. So it became almost impossible to detach oneself from being seen or perceived as a unionist or a nationalist based on your Brexit perspective, whether or not you actually identified in those terms at all. And I think whenever that aspect was compounded with the wider political dynamics that I mentioned, and particularly hardening of positions, one way and the other, through the elections and the succession of elections that we had in Northern Ireland, what we started to see was in part a reaction to that assumed identity that came with taking a position on the Brexit issue, with, I guess, a sense of apathy, and not a sense of apathy, a sense of just real frustration, I should say, with the lack of politics in Northern Ireland, the lack of representation. And when you talk to people that were involved in the political spectrum at that time, they're very much of the view that there was a certain degree of, I guess, a type of protest vote almost, to push against the status quo, to really try for something new. Once the picture became a little bit clearer around what Brexit would mean for Northern Ireland, then people, I think, felt a little bit more comfortable in being able to say they were pro or anti-protocol. It almost helped to clarify that it wasn't necessarily tied to those ideas of unionism and nationalism. Yes, there was still that link, there is still that link, but that it was possible to have those perspectives in a somewhat removed character. And I think the European elections very much brought that to the fore as well. So I think it has really opened up the conversation around what it is to be other in Northern Ireland, and particularly given the increased diversity in a more general sense that we have in Northern Ireland, thinking about, well, how do individuals who haven't been brought up as unionist or nationalist or within those particular communities fit into this overall political picture and those dynamics? And I think we're at a bit of a tipping point of sorts at the moment, insofar as we're starting to have these conversations around what the future institutions will need to look like in order to take account of the changes we're seeing now. But I don't think we would be having those conversations at this point in time only for Brexit's accelerating impact on that situation.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Katy to take the stage, the virtual stage, and to present some work that draws on the taking the temperature poll that she's been doing as part of the post-Brexit governance in Northern Ireland project. Katy?
Thanks very much, Dan, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this event, and thank you to everybody who's watching. So I'm just going to share slides. You won't be surprised to hear. So I am literally going to pick up where Claire left off in terms of considering the prospects for electoral change in Northern Ireland, thinking in particular around the protocol, but also a bit more broadly around the broader impact that Brexit has had on the situation here with respect to identities and public attitudes. And I'm going to be as quick as possible and taking a fairly broad view, but looking in detail at one or two of the questions that we have asked in this poll that Dan refers to under the post-Brexit governance project. So just to put it in context, it's always important to do that, I think. I mean, bearing in mind that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement didn't resolve and settle things so much, I think part of the genius of it, if you like, is that there is no set future. There is written in now to law the possibility of a significant change to the UK Constitution with respect to the possibility of Irish unification through a referendum. There is so-called constructive ambiguity in the agreement itself, which enabled unionists and nationalists and others to sign up to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. But absolutely critical to its success has been the fact that we have clear structures of cooperation and collaboration built into the Good Friday Agreement between unionists and nationalists in the Assembly, which is increasingly under pressure, north-south on the island, and of course, east-west in the British-Irish relationship. So that was absolutely fundamental to bringing the stability needed, given that ultimately there is this big question mark over the future of Northern Ireland's constitutional status. Then post-Good Friday Agreement, essentially what we've seen is, as Claire has articulated very well, an evolution of society, if you like, one generation or maybe even coming to a second generation who have grown up in a post-agreement context. What we haven't seen necessarily is a huge diversification of political identities as represented by political parties. And a shameless plug for a book that I've co-authored with Colin Coulter, Pete Schroeder and Niall Gilmartin. There's looking in detail there at what's happened in terms of the evolution of Northern Ireland as a society, and considering that question of why we seem still to be stuck in certain ways with respect to the political representation. And that's just this is just to demonstrate it. This is just looking since 2010 at the first preference votes from elections that we've had here. The red line is the Brexit referendum, and just seeing the proportion of first preference votes going to Unionist, Nationalist or other parties. Of course, as you'll understand, the Assembly uses proportional representation, so it's not immediately reflected in terms of seat share. But you can see, as Claire was mentioning there, the difference made by the success of the Alliance Party, in particular in the European elections, taking one of the 3 seats for the MEPs, and then in the Westminster election, taking an MP seat. And a lot of that was related to hope for a second referendum, the sort of the pro-Remain vote that was corralled by the Alliance Party in that particular context. As Claire says, what happens now? Post-Brexit, perhaps then there is a fresh momentum for that sort of non-aligned identity if it's Remain. Now we're post-protocol, what does that actually mean? And I do think we also need to recognise what's happened post-Brexit with respect to anticipation of Irish unity and how that dynamic is completely transformed, really. So this is based on John Gary's study from the election study of 2016, so basically looking at what happened in the referendum, and you can see there how clear nationalists, clear pro-Remain support amongst nationalists, pro-Leave amongst Unionists, although the UP was pro-Remain, and then you see the Alliance Party in the middle, very strongly pro-Remain. This is a slightly complex slide, but essentially my point here, and this is from the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey data, and another shameless plug, we're going to have the results of the 2021 NILT being published at the end of May, so looking forward to be able to analyse and share those. But you could see what a difference it made between 2019 and 2020. So what changed in that time? Well, we have the withdrawal agreement and the protocol. I think that's very present in people's understanding of the potential impact that Brexit had on the prospect for United Ireland. And essentially the headline finding from all of this, as you may have seen in other work published through UK and a Changing Europe, is that we saw a plurality of unionists now in 2020 thinking that Brexit made a United Ireland more likely, whereas before they were saying it really made no difference. Nationalists since 2017 had been of that view, and we also see a large portion of those who are neither unionists nor nationalists thinking that Brexit makes United Ireland more likely. So this is a really, we can't take away this sort of constitutional future question from Brexit protocol questions. I want to use the data that we've gathered now in the Testing the Temperature polls to be able to investigate that a little bit in a little bit more detail. This is that's the reference to the website, and my colleague Professor David Finnemore leads this project. So we have conducted 4 polls. They're basically every 4 months as part of this project since the beginning of the end of the transition period, beginning of last year. And we've just had our 4th poll. It was conducted after the week in which Paul Givan resigned as First Minister and Edwin Poots ordered a stop to checks on agri-food products coming into Northern Ireland from GB. The protocol was very much in the news when the poll was conducted using an opinion panel, and we had over 3,000 responses. Our weighted sample is 1,500 with a margin of error plus or minus 2.3%. So I'm just going to give you, I won't give you all the details, but please go and look at that website if you want to see our report, which gives you the overall findings from each of the questions that we've asked. I'm just going to share with you some broad overview of what we've been able to analyze as a result of these polls. So essentially, and I'll let your eyes adjust to this chat. It gets even worse, I warn you. So we have asked in our first question, basically people's opinion on Brexit, the protocol. And these black lines in the middle are the average results. Black unbroken line is agree, broken line is disagree. And this is just, and thanks to my PhD student, Ben Rusher, for his help in analyzing all of this. Essentially, you can see here, when we're looking at strong unionist and strong nationalist opinion, that they are sort of mirroring each other. So you can see here, nationalists of the view that Brexit is on balance a bad thing, unionists, strong unionists of the view that Brexit is on balance a good thing. And then you can see the majority of people in Northern Ireland, pretty much along the same lines as the referendum outcome, thinking that it's on balance a bad thing. And as you can see, this is the polling from February, and you can see we've literally just got a majority, 50% thinking the protocol is on balance good for Northern Ireland, and around the same think it's appropriate for managing the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland. A clear majority think that particular arrangements are necessary for Northern Ireland arising from Brexit, and that's remained the case across the year. What's happened in October was we saw a shift, a notable increase in those who thinking that protocol is on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. Just to investigate this a little bit more, this question of is the protocol on balance good? And I warned you it's going to get more complicated in terms of the charts. So here we can see those unbroken lines are agreeing. So those who think that the protocol is on balance good, those unbroken lines. So you can see very clearly that there's nationalist opinion is that the protocol is on balance good, and that nationalist opinion around the protocol hasn't really changed, although slight nationalists and the softer nationalists, as they would, this is self-description, have increased in their view that it's on balance good. And then we see, looking at the yellow lines there, those who are neither unionist nor nationalist, they weren't strongly convinced around the protocol, but we did see a significant change in October. And it's worth bearing in mind that at the time we had a lot of headlines from Britain around empty shelves and fuel shortages, etc., which some people put down to an impact of Brexit. And we didn't have those here in Northern Ireland. And so that's potentially affecting people's views on whether the protocol is good. And that has pretty much remained the same. People who thought that in October seem to be still thinking so in February. One other thing to draw your attention to is quite how, again, the mirror opposite the strong unionists are to the strong nationalists in thinking that the protocol is on balance bad. And also here you can see the orange unbroken line and the red unbroken line. You can see there's a difference there between strong unionists and slight unionists. That's very notable compared to the agreement between slight nationalists and strong nationalists. I'll just keep an eye on the time. So again, we've asked these same questions since our poll last March, and these show you the results of taking those who think it's having a positive effect and taking away from that those who think it's had a negative impact. And you can see there's a lot of red there. So essentially, there's a lot of a sense of the protocol having a negative impact. And this was across the board in the March and June polls. However, things did change in October, as I mentioned before. What we saw in October was a move towards a plurality of people thinking that the protocol is having a positive impact on the economy of Northern Ireland, positive effect on the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, on North-South cooperation, on individual rights. Biggest issues of concern remain the impact of the protocol on political stability in Northern Ireland and on British-Irish UK-EU relations, possibly unsurprising, especially given, as I say, what was in the headlines at the time of the poll. That last column there, you can see things are moving upwards in a sort of towards a positive, in a positive direction, but from a very low baseline in people's assessment of the protocol. And then this is why this is all directly relevant to the election that we've got coming up in May. So as you may be aware, very unusually in the revised version of the protocol that Boris Johnson negotiated, essentially what we had included was a so-called democratic consent vote. So Northern Ireland MLAs get to vote on whether the protocol should continue to apply fully, or whether Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol, which essentially relates to the so-called Irish Sea border, should be discontinued, at which point it goes back to the UK and EU to come up with another, an alternative to that. So essentially what you have, therefore, is a responsibility for the MLAs to make a decision on that particular principle, although the detail of it will be UK-EU negotiation. Just to draw your attention to the table there. So we have seen an increase in those who want full application of the protocol. And that's come from those who previously seemed to have no interest or had no preference on it. We have seen relative consistency amongst those who are basically wanting the discontinuation of Articles 5 to 10. So that really hasn't changed. Similarly, we've asked the question relating it to the election. So asking, have the statement, I will only vote in 2022 for candidates who are, and favor of continued application of the protocol, against it, Articles 5 to 10, or in favor of scrapping the whole thing. And again, in that table, you can see how little things have shifted really over the course of time. So people's views on this haven't changed dramatically. And what we've seen fairly consistently is around 1 in 5 saying it really won't determine how they vote. And to come on to my last slide on this data, this is quite an illuminating sub-analysis, I think, of this matter. So you can see here that those who are strongly nationalist are saying that they'll only vote for those in favour of continued application of the protocol. Similarly with slightly nationalists, although a few more of them say it doesn't really matter. Then you come to the neithers. So although we know they're very pro-protocol, they think it's on balance a good thing, they were very pro-Remain. When you're looking at what's happening on this particular question, they are saying the candidate's position on the protocol won't affect how they vote. And when you think of those neithers, and you think about particularly the platforms of Alliance Party and the Green Party, for example, there is an array of issues that they try and raise in the public sphere that don't relate to the constitutional question, of course, don't relate to the protocol necessarily. So perhaps that's not surprising. Then we come to the slightly unionists, who mainly would support the Ulster Unionist Party. And you see even almost 1 in 2 of them saying the candidate's position on the protocol won't affect how they vote. So as Claire mentioned, the UP position is really interesting on this one, even though we see a majority who want, who are against continued application of Articles 5 to 10 compared to those who are in favour of it. Actually, when it's about casting their vote, it's not the issue. And this is in contrast to the strong unionists, mainly DUP, traditional unionist voice supporters. Almost 2/3 of them want the whole thing scrapped. And this helps us understand why the DUP perhaps is positioning itself the way it is, and how difficult it will be for the DUP and others who've had this very strong anti-protocol line to accept anything perhaps in movement to with respect to putting a protocol on a more even keel, given that so many supporters of theirs would want the whole thing scrapped. So to look into, this is to conclude, something short of a prediction, but what it means, well, moderate unionists and others will vote on issues other than the protocol, and lower turnout, as we've seen in 2016 Assembly election compared to the 2017 one. If there is a lower turnout, it will probably favour the hardliners. I think Lisa will say a bit more about that. And what would turn people off perhaps would be an election campaign that's completely concentrated on the protocol. Nationalists won't vote for anti-protocol candidates, we're clear about that. But there again, nationalist candidates will not from the main two parties anyway, won't be anti-protocol. And then strong unionists will only vote for anti-protocol candidates and ones who are pretty vociferously anti-protocol. And then it does, looking at this and looking at the way that we've seen the election results in the past, a pro-protocol majority does look likely, but that might be in effect even if people aren't voting for those candidates on the basis of them being pro-protocol. You could understand why approaching the protocol as a constitutional future question may rally unionists, particularly in light, as I say, of that fact that people, even unionists, now increasingly believe that a United Ireland is made more likely by Brexit. That might rally them around that issue. Might do so temporarily, but the question is to what end, especially if they are in a minority. And this is, as I meant, as Claire reflected, this puts the whole future of power sharing, the whole assembly future, in a really difficult place, given that apart from anything else, the future of the protocol is not something that's necessarily really in the hands of whoever's elected in the upcoming election. It still remains very much a UK-EU issue and concern. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Katy. That was fascinating, extraordinarily rich. I wanted to pick up on some of the things you were saying at the end about strong unionists and the DUP and traditional unionist voice and so on, and you know what the future prospects are for people in that kind of a position in the political system in Northern Ireland. And I guess my question is partly trying to sort of look back and ask, you know, did it have to be this way? So how far do you think the political leadership of unionism, and particularly, I guess, the DUP, had to respond to its constituency base in a sort of anti-protocol way, or you know, might there have been a different sort of possibility that was that tried to lead at least a segment of unionist opinion into a into a less complete sort of rejection of the idea of the protocol?
No, Dan, it didn't have to be this way. And it's easy to forget, but actually in 2020, we did see basically the key figures in the DUP, including Arlene Foster, including Edwin Poots, sort of getting to the point of saying, well, we don't like this, but we sort of have to live with it and make the best of it. And they said that publicly in the media, they said it on record in Parliament, etc. And that was kind of the position. Even when we had the disruption that hadn't been necessarily anticipated by everybody at the beginning of January last year, what did change things a lot was the EU's flirtation with triggering Article 16 at the end of January. And then you had momentum behind this question of the motives behind the protocol, the effect of the protocol on Northern Ireland's place, and real suspicion around the intention and understanding on the EU side with respect to Northern Ireland. And Lisa might mention that a bit too. And then since that point, it's very interesting. There's big decision for the DUP as to where it goes. And we're seeing that within what happened with the leadership challenges, etc. It's very fragmented internally. And it's obviously clearly made the decision to try and move rightwards and to sort of try and prevent votes leaking to the TUV. But we should bear in mind that the TUV is a tiny party with one MLA. It'd be very unlikely to see it stand candidates in every constituency, of course, or even constituencies that it have a chance in. So the real electoral threat from the TV is less than you might anticipate, but yet we can see playing out even in the given Hoots events, decisions that week, this sort of struggle with the DUP to try and present themselves as defending the union by being anti-protocol. But as I say, how sustainable that is in the longer term, even as keeping everybody together on that strong unionist front, is possibly more doubtful than they might anticipate.
Thanks. That's really, really helpful. Perhaps we'll come back to some of those sorts of questions in the panel discussion. We've certainly got a question lined up, which might trigger a further discussion of that. For now, though, let's move on to Lisa Whitten's presentation. I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah, thanks. Dan, I'll just get screen share up. Hopefully. Is that good? Are we all good? Yep.
Yep.
I'm going to presume so. One of the benefits of going last on a panel such as this is that you get to rely somewhat on the quality of presentations that go before. And today's not an exception. So following Clare and Katy's really detailed and quite comprehensive presentations, I thought I might cover an issue or a collection of issues that are more specific perhaps, and I would suggest tend to be lesser discussed in conversations and analyses of the politics of Northern Ireland than they perhaps are elsewhere in the UK and further afield. I've titled the presentation The Information Challenge in the run-up to the Northern Ireland Assembly elections of 2022. And what I want to do is to consider some questions around information and misinformation, concerns about that on political issues in Northern Ireland in the run-up to the election, and specifically on levels of understanding about the protocol, which has been so dominant in the political arena here of late. And also go through some of the data we have, again, from the testing and temperature polls that we've run with Katy and a colleague, David Finnemore, in Queen's, on the amount of trust and mistrust in Northern Ireland in relation to certain actors and institutions and their ability to act on behalf of Northern Ireland and in Northern Ireland's interests in managing the protocol. And yeah, I then want to make the case that this information challenge matters, particularly as we move further into the election period here in Northern Ireland. And in doing that, to kind of set out some of the reasons why they're particularly important given the unique context of Northern Ireland. So I'll try to do it quite briefly, but we'll see. So in the 4 testing the temperature polls that we have run so far on opinions about Brexit and the protocol in Northern Ireland, respondents have self-reported high levels of understanding about the protocol, which has been quite notable, but there's also been some concerns about the availability of information, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But in this most recent poll, and in one could argue an archetypal kind of academic move, we decided to test some of that self-reported understanding among participants about what the protocol does or does not do. And this is on the screen, this is what we kind of found. It's quite interesting and revealing. On the slide here, the correct answers are circled. And what we see is that despite self-reported confidence in the knowledge of the protocol, And keeping in mind also that these surveys are run using an online opinion panel. So one can say that the sample tends to be people who are politically engaged and perhaps therefore have above average, and one can assume they would have above average levels of knowledge and interest in political issues. So keeping that in mind, what we see is that there isn't the level of understanding isn't great about some of the details. So on that first line there, 79% of respondents believe that the protocol provided for the continuation of the 4 freedoms, so-called, the free movement of goods, services, capital and people on the island of Ireland, when in actuality it only really provides for the continued free movement of goods. A majority, 55%, correctly believe that Northern Ireland remains part of the UK customs territory and the internal market of the UK, but 34% believe this to be false, which I think is quite significant, and 11% don't know either way. A higher percentage of 47% thought that the common travel area and the protocol together provided for unfettered access of goods and people, compared to 40% who knew this not to be the case. Most people were aware that Article 16 of the protocol does not provide a mechanism to remove it entirely, but 36% think that it does. Most of the respondents got the question on the rights and safeguards dynamic provisions in the protocol correct, with 57% recognising this to be the case. So the protocol commits the United Kingdom to ensuring the rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity provisions in the 1998 agreement are not diminished. And then just finally, this one was quite stark. Only 26% of respondents realised that Northern Ireland has been part of UK delegations represented at formal meetings of joint bodies between the UK and EU set up to oversee the implementation of the protocol. So what all of this means broadly, the picture suggests that on this really crucial political issue of the protocol, on which there's been a lot of discussion in the Northern Ireland context, and also our MLAs are due, as Claire mentioned and Katy referred to take a decisive vote in 2024, and on which Northern Ireland voters are considering as a decisive factor in how they plan to vote in the upcoming election. There are clear gaps in public understanding about its provisions and effects. At the same time, what we also see is that the survey data shows that there isn't a lot of confidence broadly in Northern Ireland about the quality and the neutrality of information provided by print and broadcast media on the central issue of the protocol. Again, this is a kind of lack of faith in media is a broad theme, but as we go through, it's has particular consequence in the Northern Ireland context. We've also linked to this kind of faith in information. We have routinely asked in our polls about levels of public trust in different actors and institutions on the question of managing Northern Ireland's interests in respect to the protocol. And the responses, as you can see on the slide, some of them are quite stark. Only one group enjoys the trust of a majority of the population on this question. That's Northern Ireland business representatives. The 2 largest parties are distrusted or distrusted a lot by over half of respondents, with Sinn Féin on 55% and the DUP on 72% levels of distrust respectively. It's a pretty split picture on the Irish government and the European Commission, which is perhaps not surprising given the divisions that exist over the protocol and which have already been referred to. So the European Commission is on 45% of people who trust or strongly trust or trust a lot, and versus 45% distrust or distrust a lot, while the Irish government 42% trust or distrust a lot, trust or trust a lot, and 46% distrust or distrust a lot. When we look then at the UK government figures, it's really quite remarkable. Only 4% of respondents trust the UK government to manage Northern Ireland's interests in respect to the protocol, with 84% distrusting them on this question. And that's been quite a strong finding, consistent throughout. So we haven't had, I think 7% is the highest that the level of trust has been. And that's particularly important because it is the UK government that has the responsibility under the withdrawal agreement and the protocol arrangements to act on behalf of Northern Ireland. So that lack of trust is concerning and raises real questions about legitimacy and consent, broadly conceived. So speaking of those consequences and thinking through why this information and kind of trust challenge matters in the current scenario in Northern Ireland and its particular context, I want to say quite briefly raise three issues about institutional stability, voter engagement, and legislative complexity. Some of these areas have already been touched on, so I will go through quite briefly and hopefully link it all up. Firstly, institutional stability. As already mentioned, the sustainability of the devolved institutions, as Claire kind of set out in detail, are under pressure, facing quite existential challenges. I've noted there on the slide the Northern Ireland Ministers' Elections and Petitions of Concern Act 2022 that Claire already mentioned and articulated so well. That shifted things slightly about in respect to the consequences of the resignation of the First Minister, Paul Givan, also mentioned and highlighted, flagged on the slide. So yeah, that shifted the consequences. So we do have some legislative powers remaining with ministers staying in post. But I would suggest that this kind of picture links to concerns about information and levels of understanding and trust, because while distrust in politicians and institutions is a phenomenon that we see across the UK and further afield, because of the particular governing arrangements in Northern Ireland under power sharing, there is a greater precarity and vulnerability that's in a sense written into the institutions of government, and relatedly the nature of political debate and the structure of government being so divided and kind of still having a post-conflict flavour. So this is the kind of context in which levels of public trust being low and concerns about misinformation being high, this sits in this broader context of potential institutional instability, which leads to the second kind of consequential factor and issue to consider in this context, which is about voter engagement. As you can see on the screen, Northern Ireland has had the lowest levels of turnout in recent UK general elections since 2010 through to 2019. And since 1998 in assembly elections, the turnout has broadly been in decline, albeit with a jump in 2017, notably in the context of the recent collapse of devolved government. Happened in January 2017, and in an especially polarised scenario relating to the fallout of the renewable heat incentive scheme and also divisions over Brexit. So thinking through that kind of the trio of challenges already mentioned around quality of information and levels of trust and understanding, and also in the context of the lack of resilience of the governing institutions, as evidenced in the recent collapse and resignation and the partial decision-making powers that we still have at present. There are two ways that I think this collection of issues and challenges could play out in respect to voter engagement. One is to say that we could see a scenario of just increasing electoral apathy and sense of disenfranchisement and detachment. Alternatively, and I would suggest that we'll see these two dynamics playing out in parallel, as an increase in electoral frustration and potential growing polarisation of the debate. Drawing again on some of the survey data about voters' priorities, we see, I'm sorry for the small print, so this grid in the bottom here sets out those issues that voters think are most ranked in levels of concern that they have. So those who think, for example, the future of the NHS, 32% rank that as the most important issue for them. And I kind of just flag that. And the state of the economy also being ranked highly, and there being quite strong divisions on the constitutional future of Northern Ireland, and the effect of the protocol being ranked lower than the other socioeconomic issues and the NHS. Just kind of raising this issue around the political stagnation and the risk of a prolonged period of stasis due to the institutional instability, linking that into voter engagement and the risk of a growing sense of detachment and lack of policy issues, those policy issues that are of concern to the population being addressed. These dynamics and trajectories, the picture is not looking too bright, I'm afraid. The final issue I want to raise is about legislative complexity, and I'm conscious of time here, and policy development in Northern Ireland post-Brexit. This last slide is quickly becoming my favourite to present on, and what it tries to do is give us an overview of the different legislative spheres or arenas of legislation that apply to or are relevant for Northern Ireland under its newly kind of unique position post-Brexit under the protocol. And what you see is that the governing infrastructure and structure is really complex. I'm going to just run through really quickly. So inputting to the development of policy and governance in Northern Ireland. Today we have the 1998 agreement institutions, including the devolved government, also north-south and east-west institutions. The broader UK-Ireland relationship, including commitments made under the Common Travel Area, protocol applicable EU law. It's an issue of contention, but Northern Ireland is in a position of dynamic alignment with a body of specific EU laws that apply under the protocol. And related to that, there is also an obligation to keep track with relevant case law of the European Court of Justice. Mapping on top of the north-south dynamic in the 1998 agreement and the east-west dynamic of the 1998 agreement and bilateral relations between Ireland and the UK, we have the broader UK-EU relationship as set out and provided for in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA. Also related to that, you have the development of the UK's foreign policy, including the signing of free trade agreements with non-EU countries. Which, because of all of these other spheres, is now of increased significance for Northern Ireland, given its potential interaction with the protocol and the 1998 agreement dynamics. Lastly then, coming into land, there is the continued development of domestic law, which, as the subtitles kind of indicate, is in a period of particular flux in post-Brexit context. And also is going to interact with all of these other spheres. So the purpose here in just laying this out is to underline the context in which we see institutional instability, the risk of voter disengagement, linking back into these concerns about information and the information challenge, and lower degrees of trust. To an extent, legislative complexity and complexity in government is unavoidable and not necessarily negative. But what I want to suggest is that if this arrangement, as we see here, isn't managed well or is unmanaged, it is going to make effective government in Northern Ireland really difficult. And there is a risk that in so doing, there is a kind of erosion of legitimacy in government and in the political institutions here in Northern Ireland. So hopefully, I realise I've covered quite a kind of broad spectrum there, but hopefully you can see the thread running through, that as we see concerns rising about the quality of information available in Northern Ireland on a central political issue of the protocol, there also being evident gaps in public understanding about that issue and low levels of trust in actors and institutions, particularly those that are tasked with managing it. All of this linking into risks around voter disengagement and potential political polarisation and public polarisation. Also this eye-watering complexity that there now is in post-Brexit Northern Ireland. I want to suggest that this information challenge, as I've kind of termed it, is an important and significant one to be aware of, especially given its particular implications in the unique Northern Ireland context as we move forward. On that rather bleak note, for which I'm quite sorry, I'm going to stop sharing and look forward to discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. That was, again, really, really fascinating. I wonder if I could press you a little bit on, you talked about a risk of apathy and a risk of frustration and polarization, and sort of presented them as alternatives. But how do you see the relationship between them? Could they both happen at the same time? And can I ask others just to put your cameras back on, and we'll, after Lisa's answered that question, we'll move into a wider discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I don't really see them as alternatives in a sense. I kind of think we would see them play out in parallel, but in different, across the divided electorate that there is in Northern Ireland. So particularly around that, the neither group, the growing group of those who don't identify as unionist or nationalist in Northern Ireland, the levels of engagement tend to be lower there. And I think as we look at that kind of instability in institutions and perhaps a sense of exasperation in one group, in that neither group, we may see more trend towards disengagement and apathy, while at the same time in those who strongly identify as either unionist or nationalist, and a growing engagement, and doing that in a polarized way, and the debate becoming more heated and tense, and perhaps therefore overall there's a growing discrepancy between the kind of true makeup of the Northern Ireland electorate and population and the political narratives that are at play. So
just sort of bread and butter issues not really being addressed, and that increases apathy, but also puts the accent on polarization. I'm going to go to some of the questions we have now. I'm going to break one down into two parts and maybe pick up some of the things that Katy was talking about in terms of the impact of the EU's flirtation with triggering Article 16. So we have a question which I'll break into two parts, and the first is about the UK government's handling of the of Northern Ireland through the Brexit negotiations, and it describes that handling as inept. I guess I would maybe press on that a little bit around choices the UK government has made in relation, for example, to, again, fairly prosaic but important issues like SPS inspections at borders, maybe the priority given to the negotiation of new free trade agreements for the UK as a whole, which, as Lisa was saying, kind of adds to the complexity of Northern Ireland. So any reflections on the UK, and we've seen from Lisa's presentation that levels of trust in the UK government seem pretty comprehensively catastrophic, very, very low indeed. So any observations on what the UK government has brought to the protocol party, as it were?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in terms of how it could have been handled, I think the thing is, of course, Northern Ireland ultimately became very significant in the withdrawal negotiations, at least symbolically. And I think a rush to use it in that way was not necessarily helpful. So, for example, with respect to Prime Minister Theresa May's reference to Northern Ireland being an integral part of the UK's internal market, I mean, that kind of language had never been really contemplated before. And it was always in pushback to the EU's position, and a direct, deliberate reflection upon what the EU was saying about its own internal market. And I think gradually what happened was a sort of possibly just as a result of the fact that we were having negotiations and sort of bargaining, is just a move towards that point of continually seeing things in direct tension. And as we know from the very nature of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, that doesn't work for here. You need to try and avoid that as much as possible. But what happened over that time was increasingly thinking of it in those terms. And although the protocol is necessarily highly complex and did necessarily involve compromise on both sides, instead it's been seen as in a sort of a zero-sum way. And hence the response to that flirtation with Article 16, i.e. it was seen as, setting aside all the reasons for it in complexity and mistakes, etc., as being, well, the EU could see a hard Irish border, so therefore why have we got the Irish sea border? And just that land versus sea border is the starkest representation of the protocol, which is obviously more complicated than that. And so now, unfortunately, I think we're way beyond the point of, despite all the sense of trying to be pragmatic, but we are beyond that. It is very much a political negotiation and point of principles. And so when you're talking in those terms about Northern Ireland's future, when it's about principles and almost absolute principles, it's raising expectations that simply won't be sustainable or met by the outcome of any agreed process of negotiation between the UK and the EU. Again, if we're going to find an agreement, it'll be involving accommodation and compromise. So I didn't mention the word inept, and I didn't mention Boris Johnson either.
So the other part of the question is whether Sinn Féin is the main beneficiary of the UK's approach to these, the UK government's approach to these issues. I mean, Katy, or indeed either Lisa or Claire, and do you want to jump in on that?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. It's an interesting question because at the time of the referendum, anecdotally, I know of some nationalists who had voted to leave in order to try and bring about conditions to essentially propel things towards the conversations around a border poll and eventually Irish reunification. So for Sinn Féin, in many ways, actually, the whole Brexit situation and all of the challenges and travails that have come over the last, goodness me, how many, 7 years now at this stage, have really played into their hands in terms of that bigger ambition around achieving Irish reunification, notwithstanding the issues that it's causing on the ground for them in terms of the problems their constituents are facing, difficulties with having governance going and moving consistently within Northern Ireland. I think in terms of that particular aspect of their political identity and political agenda, the Brexit situation has very much aided that, and certainly the way that the UK government has handled the situation has only further added to it.
Thanks. Anyone else want to chip in, or shall we move on to some other questions? So we have several questions from John Curtis. One is asking whether people who evaluate the protocol favorably are saying that it's an acceptable compromise, or does it reflect instead that they value being in I guess the EU's single market? Do you have any evidence from your polling that would speak to that?
No, we don't have any. So we don't. I might pass over to Lisa in a second to say about the qualitative comments, which people, there's an optional space and some people write an awful lot in that space that Lisa then codes and analyzes. But in terms of, the only thing you could possibly point to, and we phrase the question carefully around whether it's on balance a good thing, whether it's appropriate, and I think it's when we've seen people saying economic impact of the protocol is positive, and that's definitely been reflected then in people thinking overall it's a good thing. But we should recognize that when we ask around the impact of the protocol more broadly and around concerns that people have, there is they are very significant concerns around the need for customs paperwork on all goods coming into Northern Ireland, etc., etc. But I think, I'll hand over to Lisa to see if you can think of any of the qualitative comments that explain why people have that view of the protocol.
Yeah, thanks, Katy. There is, as we do receive a lot of comments, people expressing their views. And what I would say, it's really quite interesting to see that their views are nuanced about the protocol, more so than it might suggest. Although the picture is broadly divided, there tends to be kind of more consideration than you might think. So broadly, when you look at those comments and code them for different attitudes and kind of postures towards the protocol, you see 5 different things emerge. On the positive side, you see some people describing it as positive because they perceive it as beneficial already. And you could kind of delineate that, although it's not clear from the data, but that they would likely be from a nationalist background on occasion, but because they would, as Claire indicated, kind of see it as instrumentally valuable from their political affiliation perspective. But also you get those who are saying this is an economic opportunity that exists. So you kind of see those 2 different ways of seeing it as already beneficial. You also see people who see it as potentially beneficial if it can be implemented well, and if the institutions of government can agree and kind of move forward, and there can be progress at a UK EU level, but also at a Northern Ireland level, to kind of make it work. Then you see people who see it as a positive, but in the context of Brexit, as a kind of fix, as a least worst option, and one that therefore should be implemented and made to work, but it's in that kind of a resigned positive. There's also then people who see it negatively, split across those who see it negatively in principle and perceive it as a kind of often very strongly held views around its impact on identity issues, and then those who see it as a negative because of their experience of it or perception of its negative economic effects tends to focus on. So there is nuance out there. Not sure if it's a full answer to John's question.
Just to follow up on that, you talked quite a lot about levels of misunderstanding, and is there? Can you see a relationship to how well people understand the arrangements and whether they support them or not?
Not. I don't have data to make that correlation. Although I would say, and in kind of making a point and focusing on levels of understanding, I think it's important to recognize that this is a complex arrangement, and that we are taking even a step back, that it's an unusual position that a relatively niche legal text is such a central political question and has such a kind of significance going forward, given the consent votes and the way that it's playing out in relation to all of those other aspects of governance. So there's an understandable aspect to that, But I also do think that when we look at the data around understanding, it's clear that there isn't a lot of information out there. There are mistruths that could be usefully addressed about what the protocol does and how. So it's kind of two dynamics going on.
Thank you. So a last question for Clare, and indeed anyone else on the panel who wants to pick it up, and it's whether Brexit changed identities in Northern Ireland, or politicized or simply politicized or further politicized identities that were already there.
It's an interesting question. I guess there's a couple of elements to this. I mean, yes, I don't want to say it changed identity. It very much reinforced pre-existing identities. The initial response to Brexit was to really strengthen the extremes of the political spectrum in Northern Ireland, electorally at least. And made reference indeed across all the presentations, I think, towards this centre ground perspective and emerging perspective. I don't think that's accurate to say that it has changed anything, but I think it has contributed to changing dynamics, if that makes sense. And I don't think it's accurate either to necessarily characterise what has happened as a politicisation necessarily of the perspectives. There is an indelible cross-reference between the two, like they very much feed off each other in terms of the identity questions and the political dynamics in Northern Ireland. And whenever you add Brexit into that as well, it makes for a very complex set of arrangements and dynamics at play within that. But yeah, I'm uncomfortable with the language around change, but definitely Brexit has had an impact in terms of how identity is spoken about, in terms of how it's thought about. It's been considered, I think, in more expansive terms, in more cultural terms, you know, and especially with the decade of centenaries that we're in at the moment, it has prompted reflection in a very different way on the types of issues that is generating. And it's coming in the mix as well with a lot of reflection and concerted conversations around how to deal with the past in Northern Ireland. And all of these elements are coming together and very much feeding this picture, which I know is going a little bit on a tangent from the initial point of the question you asked, but I think it's important to take account of the fact that Brexit is far from a standalone issue in Northern Ireland. And while we can talk about the protocol and the Brexit dynamics and indeed the different perspectives that people in Northern Ireland adopted on the protocol, actually these are all informed by and continue to inform those bigger questions politically, societally, in society and elsewhere in Northern Ireland in terms of how we actually move this forward. So it's very difficult to disentangle a question about, you know, how Brexit has potentially politicised or interacted with identity at a personal level in Northern Ireland in that regard, without taking account of all of those extenuating factors as well, which is a bit of a non-answer, I appreciate, but hopefully it gives a little bit of insight.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to come in quickly on that?
Just very briefly from the Northern Ireland Life and Times, again, this is something we've published on, but those who are neither unionist nor nationalist, we see it's within the margin of error, basically. Almost the same number of people, proportion, think that Brexit has made them more in favour of Irish unity compared to making no difference. So again, I think unionists would have an eye on that. The difficulty there is its response to a specific question that we ask, and we don't ask about other forms of identity, and that's the trap that we ended up, you end up falling into over and over again. And the difficulty is what is the scope for those other forms of politicised identities, especially given the dysfunctional nature of the Assembly and the Executive and the fact that they look set to be rather dysfunctional, as Claire's alluded to after the election, with everything put on that hook of the future of the protocol and potentially future constitutional status of Northern Ireland.
really fascinating. Thanks so much, all three of you, for brilliant presentations, which show the critical importance, I think, of sustained social science research, investigating what are certainly on this side of on this island often misunderstood, or at least understood in very highly stylized kinds of ways, realities of politics and policy and identities of governance in Northern Ireland. So getting a really good research handle on the realities of people's attitudes to how they're governed in relation to the kind of day-to-day bread and butter matters of politics, as well as the broad kind of constitutional issues, I think is a critically important contribution of the kind of research that you're all doing. So thank you very much indeed for that. It's been a real privilege to pull this session together. I'd also like to thank the people at UK in a Changing Europe and Hannah Richardson for the behind the scenes work that makes these kinds of events possible at all. Thank the audience as well for interesting questions, and hope to see you at the next of these events that we host. But for now, thanks particularly to the panelists, to Clare, Katy and Lisa.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.